Welcome back. I want to tell you something about Stalin that does not fit the image, that does not fit anything you think you know about him. And I am not going to pretend it makes him a good person. It does not. The man was responsible for the deaths of millions of his own people. Nothing changes that, but history is rarely clean. And sometimes the most revealing moments in a person's story are the ones that refuse to fit the narrative. This is one of those moments. May 1945. The war in Europe is over. The Red Army is in Berlin. The city is destroyed, not damaged badly, destroyed. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. No running water, no electricity, no food distribution system of any kind. The population that remained in the city, mostly women, children, and old people, because the men were either dead or in prisoner of war camps, was surviving on almost nothing. And among them, everywhere, were children. German children. The children of the people who had invaded the Soviet Union 4 years earlier. The children of the nation that had killed somewhere between 27 and 30 million Soviet citizens. The children of the enemy. What Stalin did about those children is the subject of today's video, and I promise you it is not what you expect. Let's go. To understand what happened in Berlin in May and June of 1945, you need to understand what the Red Army found when it got there. Because the scale of the destruction was something that even soldiers who had fought through 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history were not fully prepared for. Berlin had been bombed by the British and Americans for 2 years, and then the Red Army had fought through it street by street, building by building, room by room, for nearly 2 weeks in April and early May. By the time the fighting stopped, the city was essentially a ruin. The infrastructure was gone. The government was gone. The Nazi administration that had organized food distribution and civil services had collapsed completely. And the civilian population, approximately 2.5 million people who had not managed to flee, was left in the rubble with almost nothing. The situation for children was particularly desperate. Many of them had been separated from their parents during the final fighting. Many had parents who were dead. Many had parents who were alive but so traumatized and so focused on basic survival that the children were effectively on their own. They lived in the ruins, in cellars, in half-collapsed buildings. They ate whatever they could find. They drank water from sources that were not safe. They were hungry in a way that went beyond ordinary hunger, the kind of hunger that changes children, that marks them, that stays in the body long after the food comes back. Soviet soldiers encountered these children everywhere, in the rubble, in the streets, scavenging through destroyed buildings, some of them aggressive and feral from weeks of surviving alone. Some of them completely passive, sitting in doorways with the blank expressions of children who have processed more than children are built to process. And here is where the story begins to get complicated, because the relationship between Soviet soldiers and German civilians in the spring of 1945 was not simple. These soldiers had come from a country that Germany had invaded and devastated. They had fought through 4 years of a war of annihilation in which the Germans had shown very little mercy to Soviet civilians. They had liberated Soviet villages where every person had been killed. They had passed through Leningrad, which had been under siege for 900 days. Many of them had lost their entire families. They were not in a forgiving mood. And in the early weeks of the occupation, before order was established, terrible things happened in Berlin that I am not going to detail here, but that are part of the historical record and that cannot be erased or minimized. But here is what also happened, and this is the part that almost never gets told. Soviet soldiers fed German children, not all of them, not immediately, not as part of any organized policy. At first it was purely individual, spontaneous, soldiers sharing their own rations with children they encountered in the ruins. A soldier who had not seen his own children in 4 years, encountering a German child sitting on a pile of rubble, eating something that was not food. And something happening in that moment that had nothing to do with politics or ideology, or the fact that these were German children and he was a Soviet soldier. Something human happening in that moment. There are hundreds of documented instances of this in the diaries and letters and memoirs of Red Army soldiers from the spring and summer of 1945. Men writing home to say, "I know these are Germans, I know what Germany did to us, but I gave my bread to a child today and I would do it again." Men who had spent 4 years in a state of controlled and necessary hatred, finding that hatred complicated and confused by the sight of a hungry child who had done nothing to anyone. This was happening at the individual level before any orders came from above. The soldiers were doing it on their own, and then the orders came from above. In June 1945, Stalin issued a directive regarding the civilian population of the Soviet occupation zone in Germany. And among the provisions of that directive were specific instructions regarding the feeding and care of German children. Food distribution was to be organized, schools were to be reopened, medical care was to be provided. The children of the defeated enemy were to be fed. When this became known, and it became known gradually because Soviet directives were not exactly widely publicized, the reaction was complicated. Inside the Soviet Union, where people were themselves going hungry, where the war had devastated the agricultural system, where rationing was still severe and would remain severe for years, the idea that food was being sent to feed German children was not universally popular. To put it mildly, people asked the question directly. We are hungry. Our children are hungry. And we are feeding German children? It is a legitimate question. And Stalin's answer to it, not the public answer, which was wrapped in the language of socialist internationalism and the superiority of the Soviet system over fascism. But the real answer, the strategic answer, is worth understanding. Because Stalin did not do this out of compassion. Let's be honest about that. Stalin did not look at photographs of hungry German children and feel something in his chest that made him pick up a pen and write a directive. That is not who Stalin was. That is not how Stalin made decisions. He did it for reasons, specific, calculated, strategic reasons that had everything to do with the post-war world he was trying to build, and very little to do with the welfare of German children as such. The first reason was political. Stalin understood that the Soviet Union was now in competition with the Western Allies, Britain, France, and most importantly, the United States, for influence over post-war Germany and post-war Europe. Germany was going to be divided. The Western zones were going to be under Western influence. The Eastern zone was going to be under Soviet influence. And the population of the Eastern zone, the people living in Soviet-occupied Germany, were going to form their judgments about the Soviet system based on what they experienced in those first years. If Soviet soldiers looted and terrorized and starved the population, the people of Eastern Germany would hate the Soviet Union forever. They would be an occupied population, resentful and resistant, a permanent drain on Soviet resources and attention. If, on the other hand, Soviet administration brought order and food and schools and medical care, if the experience of Soviet occupation was, for ordinary people, survivable and, even in some ways, functional, then the foundation could be laid for something different. For a population that was not merely conquered, but gradually, over time, brought into the Soviet orbit. The feeding of German children was, in this analysis, a propaganda operation as much as a humanitarian one. Show the German people, show the world, that the Soviet Union treated the defeated enemy humanely. That Soviet socialism was not what Nazi propaganda had said it was. That the Red Army was not a horde of barbarians, but the representative of a civilized system that took care of civilians, even enemy civilians, even the children of people who had tried to destroy it. The second reason was economic. The Soviet Union needed the industrial capacity of Eastern Germany, the factories, the infrastructure, the technical expertise of the German workforce. All of this was enormously valuable to a Soviet economy that had been devastated by 4 years of war. A starving, traumatized, resentful workforce is not a productive workforce. If you want people to work, you need to feed them. If you want German engineers and workers to contribute to Soviet reconstruction, you need to give them a reason to function. Food is the most basic reason. The third reason, and this is the one that historians debate most, is that Stalin may have genuinely understood something about the psychology of defeat and occupation that many of his contemporaries did not. He had read history extensively, obsessively. We covered Stalin's private library in a video we are going to make soon, and the scope of his reading is genuinely astonishing. He knew what happened when occupying powers treated defeated populations with pure brutality. He knew about the aftermath of the First World War, the resentments that the harsh treatment of Germany had generated, the political conditions that those resentments had helped to create. He was not going to make the same mistake. He was going to be brutal where brutality served his purposes, and functional where functionality served his purposes, and he was going to make those decisions with cold calculation rather than emotion. So the directive went out. Food was distributed to German civilians. Schools reopened with Soviet-approved curricula, which meant, yes, a new ideology being taught to German children, which is its own complicated story. Medical services were organized. A German civilian administration was established under Soviet supervision. The machinery of occupation began to function in a way that was, for ordinary people trying to survive in the ruins of Berlin, at least minimally livable. And the children were fed. Now let's talk about what that actually looked like on the ground, because the directive is one thing. The reality of implementing it in a destroyed city with a devastated infrastructure and a military administration that was simultaneously trying to secure its zone, extract reparations, and establish political control. That reality was considerably messier. The food that was distributed was basic, very basic. Bread, sometimes potatoes, sometimes tinned goods. Not enough. It was never enough in those first months. But more than nothing. More than what the children had been surviving on in the ruins. The difference between enough to keep going and not enough to keep going is enormous when you are a child in a destroyed city in the summer of 1945. Soviet military doctors treated German children in field hospitals that were being simultaneously used for Soviet soldiers. There are accounts from Soviet doctors of this period that describe the experience of moving from a Soviet patient to a German patient and back, of the cognitive and emotional complexity of treating the children of the enemy with the same care you were giving to your own people. Some doctors found it straightforward. A sick child is a sick child. Some found it genuinely difficult and said so in their diaries. German teachers were recruited to reopen schools, teachers who had passed a denazification screening, which was imperfect and inconsistent, but real. And the children of Berlin began going to school again in the autumn of 1945, in damaged buildings with broken windows and insufficient heating, learning from a curriculum that had been hastily revised to remove the Nazi content and replace it with something more compatible with Soviet educational ideology. Was this liberation? Was this occupation? Was this humanitarian aid? Or was it political manipulation? The honest answer is that it was all of these things simultaneously, inseparably, tangled together in the way that power and humanity are always tangled together in the aftermath of catastrophic violence. The German children who received Soviet food in the summer of 1945 did not know or care about Stalin's strategic calculations. They were hungry, and then they were less hungry. That was the reality of their experience. The calculation behind the food was invisible to them. The food itself was real. And the Soviet soldiers who shared their rations with German children before any directive told them to, those men were not making strategic calculations. They were responding to something in themselves that 4 years of war had not entirely extinguished. Something that recognized a hungry child as a hungry child, regardless of what flag that child had been born under. There is something important in that, something worth holding on to, because the history of this period is so enormous and so full of violence and calculation and ideology that it is easy to lose sight of the individual moments. The soldier handing bread to a child in the rubble. The doctor treating a fever in a damaged hospital. The teacher opening a school in a building with no roof. These moments happened inside an enormous structure of power and politics and strategy. But they also happened between human beings. And that reality does not disappear just because the structure around it was morally compromised. Stalin ordered German children to be fed for reasons that had nothing to do with caring about German children. And German children were fed. And some of them survived who might not have survived otherwise. And the man who gave the order was the same man who had signed the death warrants of hundreds of thousands of his own people. History does not resolve this. History just holds it, the way that only history can. All of it true simultaneously, none of it canceling any other part of it out. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Germany lasted until 1990, when the Berlin Wall came down and Germany was reunified. The German Democratic Republic, the East Germany that was built on the foundation of that Soviet occupation, was in many ways a difficult and repressive place. But it was also a place where the children of 1945 grew up and had children of their own and lived lives. Lives that began in the rubble of a destroyed city, sustained in part by food that came from the army of the country that had been their enemy. The last of those children are old now. Some of them are still alive, and the world they live in, unified Germany, peaceful Europe, the post-war order that was built on the ruins of everything that came before. That world was shaped in part by decisions made in the summer of 1945 by a man sitting in the Kremlin who looked at reports of starving German children and made a cold calculation that they should be fed. The calculation was cold, the food was real, and the children ate. Thank you for watching this. This is one of the most complicated stories we have told on this channel, and I hope it gave you something to think about. Not a clean conclusion. There is no clean conclusion here. Just the full picture, as honestly as I can give it to you. If this video meant something to you, hit the like button, subscribe if you are not already here, and leave a comment. I genuinely want to know how you think about this, about the relationship between the motive behind an action and the value of the action itself, about whether cold calculation and genuine humanity can produce the same result, and whether that matters. See you in the next one.